Which Portland is better? The two largest Portlands are at opposite ends of the country, in Maine and Oregon, and they have a lot in common. Both are the largest cities in their state. Both are major ports, many people visit them, and both are slightly overshadowed culturally by nearby cities. And somehow, there aren't many videos comparing the two, so let's dive right in. Let's start with the smaller one, Portland, Maine. This one is way smaller than the one across the country, as it currently has less than 70,000 people. But it's by far the largest city and metro in Maine, with the metro having over 500,000 residents. It more than doubles any other city or metro in the state, although it is in the southwest corner of the state, in Cumberland County, less than 40 miles from the New Hampshire border, and it's only 60 miles from Massachusetts. It's less than a 2-hour drive from Boston, so many tourists come from that area. Portland is right on the Atlantic Ocean, or more specifically, on the Casco Bay, and the main part of the city is guarded by a few islands, most of which are part of the city itself. The central part of the city is on the large peninsula surrounded to the south by the Fore River and to the north by the Back Cove. Now, there are some awesome neighborhoods on the peninsula, like the interesting residential West End on the bluffs, the Old Port area in the south center, downtown in the center, and the East End or Munjoy Hill along the Casco Bay. Now, the parts off the peninsula are mostly sprawling residential, with area not too efficiently used up, but that's in part a product of the not-so-super-high population. Now, despite being on the coast, Portland isn't known for beaches, as it's more of the classic New England rocky coastline. But there are a couple of surrounding towns with beaches, like South Portland, Old Orchard Beach, Ogunquit, and York, just to name a few, although most of these are closer to Boston, meaning tourists from there might not even make it all the way to Portland. Now, Maine as a whole is known as Vacation Land, because there are so many very well-known destinations, from beaches to inland wilderness. You have Portland itself, the southwestern beaches, Acadia National Park, Baxter State Park with Mount Katahdin, many beach towns and lakefront towns, and so much more. And for most people traveling into the state, Portland is the main gateway to it all, as most destinations require driving through it. Or you'd fly into it if you're going in that direction anyway. Portland, Oregon is known more as a major American city rather than a regional city. There are 650,000 people in the city and 2.5 million in the metro, which also spans into Washington. There's an NBA team there and arenas that attract major acts, although it's slightly overshadowed in American culture by Seattle to the north and arguably Vancouver, British Columbia, for our Canadian viewers. Now, Portland is on the northern border of Oregon with Washington, sitting on the mighty Columbia River. However, that's not really where the city is centered. Yes, it does sit at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers, but downtown actually sits about 13 miles upriver, up the Willamette that is, directly between Oregon City and Fort Vancouver in Washington. This was a common destination for settlers on the Oregon Trail, as was this entire river valley. Only later did the city annex the land and former municipalities near the river and confluence. The downtown area is well packed on both sides of the river, and it was way nicer than I expected when I finally visited the area in 2025. There are 2 separate grid angles that mesh nicely together with some seating areas and smaller restaurants and vendor options right near the small blocks where these grids intersect. The West Hills cut off any further development, so there's no awkward sprawl continuing in that direction. In fact, right where downtown meets these hills, you find Washington Park, which has a number of tourist destinations. The southern part of the downtown grid nicely incorporates government buildings, the Portland State University campus, and plazas and parklets with artificial waterfalls and other things. A couple downsides: the waterfront park isn't well upkept and has many homeless people, and there are some railroad grade crossings nearby that just totally stop all traffic in the area at various times. And on the east side, I-5 is right on the waterfront, and the gridded areas are sorta cut off by viaducts from the bridges and some arterial roads, but I do say this actually makes things more interesting. And I do enjoy the bridge scene and seeing how bike paths maneuver them, and how people commute around. Now, Portland is not a coastal city, but the Oregon coast is lovely, although a minimum of 60 miles away. There are other attractions in the region, like Mount Hood and many other interesting spots in the Pacific Northwest. If you're on the interstates, then you're likely driving by Portland. However, depending where you're coming from, you aren't necessarily going through. Many tourists might anchor a Pacific Northwest vacation in Seattle instead. So obviously, Portland, Oregon is way bigger, and compared to each respective state, Portland, Oregon has a bigger percent of the state's population, at about 15% to 5% for Maine's Portland. If you're looking for a large city with large city amenities, Oregon is the one for you. If you want a small town feel, neither are the one for you. I'd say Portland, Maine has some nice smaller neighborhoods, but it still feels pretty urban. It's not a small town feel. Which city has a nicer downtown? I'm actually going to give the nod to Oregon. Maine has several nice commercial blocks along Congress Street and many walkable things and restaurants in the Old Port. But then there are parking lots in between some, and I think Commercial Street could be filled in a little better. Portland, Oregon's downtown has way more to offer, as there's more landmass and fewer hills breaking it up. Which has the better surrounding neighborhoods? I'll give that to Maine. The east and west ends are just lovely, while outside of downtown Portland, Oregon, it's more gridded suburbia, and obviously it's less historic being on the west coast. Which has better surrounding towns and suburbs? Well, that's kind of a tough one. There are definitely more choices in Oregon, because most of the towns surrounding Portland, Maine are either small rural towns or beach towns that are only seasonally populated. There aren't any major sprawling suburbs, or at least at Oregon scale. In Oregon, you could proceed up the Willamette River to places like Lake Oswego and Oregon City, which I was a little disappointed with. And there are other smaller towns even further upriver. Or you can go over the West Hills to places like Beaverton, or east into the sprawling suburb of Gresham, among others. Or you can go over the Columbia River into Vancouver, Washington, which is the fourth largest city in that state. It does feel like a region with way more options for living or exploring. Which city has better geography? Definitely Maine. Even though I always love exploring classic American river cities, especially ones on confluences, Portland simply does not take advantage of its geographic position, as the confluence itself is an afterthought. There is a small park, and I didn't even go to it the day I was there. It just wasn't high priority. The Willamette River isn't that wide, and although there's no problem with that, it can't compete with the coastline qualities of Portland, Maine, with all its rocky coastline, islands, peninsulas, and hills within the city. And I'm sure many people on the West Coast can appreciate the hills within a city, say like San Francisco. Which city has better proximity to interesting geographic attractions? That's gotta be a push. Neither city has something huge right in town, but like I said earlier, Maine serves as a gateway for most of the Northeast to Acadia, Baxter, and the entire eastern coastline. Portland, Oregon is near all the Cascadia and well-known mountains, and it's still somewhat near the coast. Bottom line, if you're going on a vacation to either, you will have no shortage of places to go. Which city is easier to get to? Well, Portland, Maine is less than 2 hours from Boston. It's known more as a driving destination than flying or cruising, and many of the tourists there are from New England, or the Northeast region altogether. Portland, Oregon is a little bit further from other major cities, being closer to 3 hours from Seattle, but then it's 6 hours to Boise, or over 8 hours to Sacramento or San Francisco. Portland, Oregon is more of a national and international destination, and its nickname is PDX, its airport code. A higher percentage of visitors fly there than they do for Maine. Portland, Maine can be seen as a day trip, while Portland, Oregon is a bigger event, so I'll give the nod to Oregon since there's more infrastructure for that. Which is easier to get around? Well, Portland, Oregon, being a major city, has a much more elaborate public transportation system, with light rail and buses all over, and even a tram system between the South Waterfront and Markham Hill. I mean, who do they think they are? Pittsburgh? Portland, Maine has some buses, but based on what I see, people are regularly confused by it all. Now, you can argue that Portland, Maine has less that even needs getting around, but frankly, the interesting neighborhoods of both cities take up a similar footprint, so that argument doesn't really hold up. Portland, Oregon has way more neighborhoods around the periphery of downtown and a larger metro, so it makes sense that things are more developed, but they definitely get the nod in this category. It's even slightly better for bicycling, with more trails and bike-friendly roads, and more outbound destinations than its Maine counterpart. If you're on the West Coast, Portland, Oregon is probably the more enticing destination. If you're an East Coaster, which I know most current viewers of this channel are, Portland, Maine is probably the more interesting destination. I guess the question is if you're in the middle of the country or even international, which is better. There's no doubt that Portland, Oregon attracts more people nationally and internationally, while Portland, Maine is more of a getaway from other parts of the Northeast, while still being in an urban environment, but perhaps not as hectic as Boston or New York. And if you're looking for that big city feel with a classic, albeit semi-modern American city with all the cultural options and food options and economic options, Portland, Oregon is definitely the better city to visit, or even be in. If you want that on the Northeast coast, Boston is the city for you. Well, except for the modern part. And you still can do a day trip to Portland, Maine. If you're looking for a quiet or beachfront vacation, Portland, Maine is still not exactly the place to go, but it's still definitely worth stopping in and even spending some time in if you do go to the area. Portland, Oregon is just a different animal, so even if you're in the Northeast, do keep it on your bucket list. But what do you think? Which Portland do you like better? Or which is better to visit? How many of you have even made the trip to both? I'd like to hear what you have to say in the comments. Thanks for watching.